for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to start, I'll be splitting my time with my colleague from Red Deer Mountain View. And before I launch into debate today, I just want to recognize Bombardier Patrick Labrie, who tragically died this week serving his country in Bulgaria. And as a serving soldier in Canada's Armed Forces, Reserves, and as a parliamentarian, I know that the thoughts and prayers of this House go out to the Labrie family, and we thank you for your service. Thank you, and I just appreciate that we can all come together in this House and support the men and women of our armed forces. It's very important, and it's not a partisan issue. Mr. Speaker, getting into the debate, it's my pleasure to rise, and talk about this Opposition Day motion on carbon taxes and the environment. And it's not an issue that we as Conservatives are afraid to talk about, because we have a very strong record on this issue. When you look at the beginning of the previous Conservative mandate in the year 2007, greenhouse gas emissions in this country were 744 million tons, megatons. And at the end of our mandate in 2015, we had brought down that number significantly below 744 million megatons, while also growing our economy. And I think that's a significant feat that we should be very proud of. And it's all very clear that this was done also without the imposition of a carbon tax on Canadians. So this government has a clear framework, an example given to it by previous governments of what can be done to lower greenhouse gas emissions while not putting taxes on hardworking families when they fill up at the pump, when they're heating homes in these cold Canadian winters, and also when they go to buy groceries or anything that gets trucked in. Now, the reason I rose today is because this debate is important for our country, it's important for the world, but it's also very important for my constituency. And the reason is that my constituency, along with the constituency of the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, is the home to Canada's, Alberta's industrial heartland region. And this is a hub in Canada for carbon capture and sequestration technology. Now, under the previous government, significant investments were made to partner with industry to find ways to tangibly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And this technology has been recognized by the International Energy Agency as one of the key pillars in ensuring sustainable and meaningful reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, on the other side of my riding, it's an important issue because in Parkland County, we're home to a significant amount, I believe over 1/3 of Canada's remaining coal-fired generation plants. And the Liberal and the previous former NDP government of Alberta's decisions on carbon taxes and red tape have had serious consequences in my community, including significant job losses in the thousands and the loss of millions, tens of millions of dollars in assessed tax revenues for municipal and county governments. And my remarks today are going to highlight, the consequences of these policies, but I also want to highlight the opportunities and tangible things that we can do moving forward to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, but also to support our industries. Now, going over the history of this, in 2015, when the NDP government came to power in Alberta, and subsequently the federal government's decisions to unilaterally end coal power by 2030, and this has presented significant challenges to my community. And it's also undermined the livelihoods of my constituents and put into doubt our ability to supply affordable power generation. Now, under the previous Conservative government, Canada took a responsible, continental-based approach with our closest ally and neighbor, the United States, to begin phasing out coal power. Now, I recognize that coal has high CO2 emissions, and that in order to meet our Paris climate change targets, that we need significant action to achieve these goals. But I couldn't disagree more with the pathway that this government has taken on this issue. Now, going back to the previous Conservative policy, we would have phased out most coal-fired power plants in this country before 2030. Now, not a lot of that is different from the current government's policies, but this is where the bulk of greenhouse gas emission reductions are going to take place, mostly from plants that were already ending their life cycle before 2030 anyways. So no major cost to taxpayers, no unexpected job losses or unexpected revenue losses for communities. Now, we also allowed for some coal facilities, the newest and latest coal facilities, with one being built as recently as 2012, to run the cycle of their life cycle up until 2045. Now, this would have resulted in significant greenhouse gas emissions while ensuring that taxpayers would not be put on the line for billions of dollars to bail out these companies for transitioning from coal to natural gas, which is what many of them were doing anyways. And I want to talk about those penalties later and what specifically they are, but I also want to say how proud I am of the investments of the previous Conservative government in the billions of dollars in supporting industries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through carbon capture and sequestration. And I just want to highlight a couple of projects in this country. We have the Shell Quest refinery, which has just celebrated its 4th megaton, so 4 million tons of CO2 that it has sequestered at its facility and put into deep saline aquifers. That's 4 million tons of CO2 that's not in our atmosphere today because of an investment by our previous Conservative government. And we also have the Northwest Redwater refinery project, which is in my riding of Sturgeon River Parkland. And when the newest refinery in Canada comes fully operational, it will sequester an estimated 1.2 million tons of CO2 a year. Now, these are tangible emissions levels. When we're talking about the government falling short of its Paris climate change agreement by 79 million tons, when we're talking about facilities in my riding that on their own are doing over 1 million tons and in facilities next to my riding already achieving 4 million tons, these aren't just chump change numbers. These are significant numbers that, if replicated across the country, across industries, can have a massive effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this can be done with very little support from the government, and it can be done without imposing a carbon tax on hardworking families. Now, these projects were the result of partnerships with federal government, and they were expensive when they were first implemented, but we have to remember that with technology, there is often high barriers to entry. We certainly had that with a lot of our renewable industries, with solar power and wind power. We know in Ontario that the consequences of government decisions have raised the cost of power for everyone in the province of Ontario. So there are high costs to doing this, but we know that once you get this technology in place and once you learn from it, it will come down in price significantly. And comments from Shell have indicated that they could replicate the Quest refinery project for 30% cheaper than what it was. So it was about a $700 million project, and they can do it for 30% cheaper. So this is an investment that we need to be replicating in this country and moving forward. And that's why I find it disappointing that when we talk about CCS in this country, we haven't really seen a lot of progress over the last 4 years. I just checked out the National Energy Board's page today, and it indicated that there are 4 major projects in this country. We have the Redwater refinery, we have the Shell Quest, which I've mentioned, we have the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, which is also in my riding, and we also have a project in Fort Nelson in northern BC, which was estimated at full capacity to be able to sequester 2.2 million tons of CO2. But since 2015, we've heard nothing about this project. There was previous government support of about $30 million from the BC government and from the federal Conservative government, but this government has taken no action. How can this government be leaving a project like this on the table? We're talking about 2.2 million tons of CO2. That's over 2% of what we need in this country to achieve our climate change goals. And yet this government, which I believe is ideologically opposed to carbon capture and sequestration, has refused to support projects like these. And I know that I'm going to be pushing for our next Conservative government to be taking up these opportunities and increasing our investment in carbon capture and sequestration so that we can actually come up with tangible results on greenhouse gas emissions. And I feel very strongly that that will be the case, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I also want to just quickly talk about, carbon pricing. The government's talking about putting up to 23 cents a litre on gas after the election. Now, Canadians already pay up to 30% of the price of a litre of gas is federal levy, provincial levy, the GST, and some provinces the HST. We're already paying carbon taxes, and we're talking about 23 new cents a litre. That's going to be nearly 50% of the cost of a litre of fuel. It's just a tax plan, Mr. Speaker. It's not an environment plan, plain and simple. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his intervention today, and in particular he mentioned Shell and talked about some of the work that Shell was doing as it relates to carbon, its carbon footprint. I'm wondering if he's aware of the fact that there was a CBC report on April the 3rd of this year that talked about Shell, and in particular said global energy giant Royal Dutch Shell is urging Canada's largest oil and gas organization to get off the fence and support both the Climate Paris Accord and the pricing on carbon to encourage greenhouse gas emissions and reductions. Even the oil producers are talking about putting a price on pollution. But I'll ask this member a much simpler question, Mr. Speaker, a real direct one. The member from Milton, the deputy leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, said, the bottom line is there's no solid connection between climate change and the major indicators of extreme weather. The continual claim of such a link is misinformation employed for political and rhetorical purposes. The member from Milton clearly doesn't believe in climate change. Mr. Speaker, does this member believe in climate change?
For Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, it's an extremely easy question to answer, Mr. Speaker. I do believe in climate change, it's obvious. But the member across, when talking about political and rhetorical ways, you know, it's quite funny that, you know, that question is just completely political and rhetorical. But I'll try to get to one of the more substantial answers. Of course, large oil companies are looking into these things because when taxes get put on all businesses, it's often these large companies that are the best capable of absorbing these taxes, and it's the small companies that suffer. And we've seen this in Alberta when the NDP government imposed carbon taxes. It was the small and medium-sized enterprises that went out of business, and it was the large companies that bought their companies for pennies on the dollar. So when we're talking about these carbon taxes, they're going after small and medium-sized enterprises, and some of these large multinational organizations that in their home countries don't pay carbon taxes are more than happy to let these companies suffer and reap the benefits.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Salaberry.
The Honourable Member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague who talked about climate change, saying that he believes in it. Young people across the country are urging the federal government to take strong action, robust action. Yet in the motion today, the Conservatives aren't putting forth anything with respect to a plan. We know that it'll be coming out tomorrow, but they haven't got anything to put forth today. So it's not very constructive when we know that over the past 10 years when the Conservatives were in power, they weren't in a position to hit the targets that they themselves had established, sector by sector, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But they never targeted the sector that is the worst culprit, the oil and gas sector. Nor did they talk about removing subsidies for fossil fuels. So it's quite difficult to understand that they'll be coming forth with a credible plan. It's also difficult to listen to them criticizing the party in power without having a counter-proposal to put on the discussion table today so that we can debate it. What does the Conservative Party have to offer then in terms of climate change? Because we know that we are facing a climate emergency and that this is a very important issue for future generations. We're working for them to ensure that they have a planet with clean air, clean water, where we can continue to work the fields as well. Thank you.
For Parkland in 1 minute or less, please.
Well, thank you, and I thank my colleague for that question. Obviously, you know, she comes from a very strong viewpoint on this matter, and we have a disagreement on the approach that we need to take here, but I think in the end we want to achieve the same goal. And in terms of our positive Conservative vision, I just need to point back to our previous 10 years in government when we implemented significant reforms for tailpipe emissions for automobiles. And this meant that all new vehicles that are used in Canada had to have, they had to be more clean, they had to have lower emissions. And this has had, significant impacts on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I just think it's ironic, because the NDP would probably, and I think they have, called the government's investments in carbon capture and sequestration subsidy for fossil fuel industries. And while this sometimes, when you give money to fossil fuel industries to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, we can have a really big benefit for our economy and for our environment. So I think certainly when we're talking about investing in CCS, we shouldn't be labeling it as a bad thing. We should be labeling it as an opportunity to grow our economy and significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
À l'ordre.